David had a lot of days like that where I'm sure he wondered what God was doing. You know, we started, the first story we saw of David as we walked through 1 Samuel is that the prophet Samuel anointed him to be the next king of Israel. And it's a long time from then until David is finally actually becomes the king. And he had a lot of troubles and a lot of bad weeks and bad years in between those. Last week's message, we looked at how Saul, the king of Israel, was pursuing David's life to kill him. And we walked through a whole bunch of stories where Saul was pursuing David. And we asked the question, how did David handle all of that? And to answer that question, we went to Psalm 57 because that was the psalm that David wrote actually when he was hiding from Saul in a cave. And that's one of the stories we looked at. And we see today him hiding in another cave. But he was hiding in a cave, and he wrote that prayer of Psalm 57. And we learned last week how he handled some of those troubles was he continued to sing praise, and he continued to give thanks to God for his steadfast love and faithfulness. But he also said his heart was fixed. And we spent some time talking about what does that mean that his heart was fixed, and how he had prepared his heart for whatever bad might come, and he was going to trust in God through all of that. Well, today is part 2 of how did David respond to that, because the numerous stories we walked through last week aren't the end of Saul's pursuit of David. In fact, it goes all the way through the end of this book of 1 Samuel that we're looking at, that Saul would be pursuing him. So today is part 2 of how did David handle that situation. Last week, just to summarize today's passage, it's going to be in 1 Samuel 24 and also 26. We'll go back to 25 next week, but 24 and 26 are parallel stories we want to consider together. We looked at 5 chapters last week, 11 different stories that I said if I preached them as 11 sermons, they get boring because they all sound alike. Saul was constantly in pursuit of David, always wanting to take his life and get rid of him. And we ended with Saul closing in on David, his army chasing David in the wilderness and closing in on him. If you don't remember how that ended or you weren't here, at the end of chapter 23 said, Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them. A message came to Saul saying, hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land. So Saul returned from pursuing after David and went to fight against the Philistines. Therefore that place was called the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-gedi. And that's where today's story picks up. Again, Saul had quit pursuing David because there was a bigger emergency. His enemies were attacking the country, and he went to take care of that. And when that situation was settled, he went back to his pursuit of David. And that's where chapter 24 picks up. Again, there's 2 parallel stories, chapter 24 and chapter 26. We're going to walk through them, and I've outlined them, but I've called them a title by a piece of something that Saul owned that became an important part of the story. So chapter 24 in your notes says Saul's robe, and chapter 26 in your notes says Saul's spear. And so let's just kind of walk through the story. And I've outlined it in 7 parts, and both stories have the pretty much exact same outline, as you'll see as we walk through them. The chapter begins with Saul's pursuit of David again. It says, when Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men of all Israel and went to seek David. Okay, Saul has 3,000 men. When David was in the cave, he had 400. He picked up a few hundred another time. So the indication is he had 600 men at this time. So Saul has an army of 3,000, his chosen soldiers, the best of his army. And David has 600, ragtag people that have joined him. And it shows you how serious Saul was about this, or how desperate probably he was to get rid of David. He was so jealous about his position as king that he thinks this is so important. I'm going to take 3,000 men and make sure this job gets done. So you see how serious he took that. It says that David was at En-gedi. En-gedi is a beautiful place. It is an oasis in the middle of the Dead Sea Desert. And all of your pictures today are going to be pictures of En-gedi. You see, when you show the aerial pictures, you'll see how much of an oasis it is and how barren the ground around there is. It's a spring that comes out of those cliffs you see in the back and comes down a valley. And it's a little tiny valley, but it is super lush because of that spring that goes through there. And today it's used to irrigate the land below just before it gets to the Dead Sea. Some of the aerial photographs, you'll see the small farmland below there. And this is where David was hiding out, this beautiful oasis. He was hiding in the caves above there. One of these pictures, you'll see the caves that are right above this area, and they had a great supply of fresh water. And so, in fact, when the Bible talks about living water, they are often referring to this particular spring in Israel because it is such a beautiful oasis. And so that's where David was hiding out. And that's what your pictures will be. By the way, I always put this up there because they ask you to, but I find pictures of the Bible lands on 2 different websites, and their names are up there in small print if you're interested. There are 2 websites that allow pastors and teachers to use their pictures for lessons and teaching and sermons and so on. And so that's what every one of these pictures that you'll see will come from. So let's move on from there. Anyway, that's where David was. There's still cliffs in the rocks above. In fact, it says in the next verse that his men were at the Wild Goat Rocks, and there's still wild goats up there. Occasionally you see them. Because it's a national park in Israel now, most of them are in pens where you can go and see them, but those goats are still there today. And being there in this cave, probably not all his men in the same cave because they aren't huge caves, but it says David and his men were in a cave. And Saul, in pursuing David, went into that same cave that David was in. It says to relieve himself. And David's men were in the back part of the cave. And this presented an incredible opportunity for David to take his revenge on Saul. If you think about it for a minute, Saul could not have been in a more vulnerable position than he was in. He was in a position that would be hard to get up from. He didn't have a weapon in his hands. He was probably his back to where David was hiding, and he didn't have any of his soldiers with him. This was a very vulnerable position. You probably can't think of a more vulnerable place that he could be. And as you read the story and think about God's sovereignty, it's almost comical that he happened to pick the same cave that David happened to be in. And that presented just an amazing opportunity. And in that opportunity, David's men gave him some advice. And that advice is in verse 6. Verse 4. The men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord has said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you." So he gets this advice. This is your chance. Don't miss it. This is not advice from God. They say this is what God has said, but we don't find that anywhere. God had never said that in this situation that we know of. And so it's not godly advice, it's worldly advice that David is being given. And David understands that God's will and God's opportunities never contradict God's word. And he knew to kill Saul would be against God's word. You've probably heard me say that, I don't know how many hundreds of times over 20 years, because it's such a critical principle that God's will never contradicts God's word. And David understood that. And he said, no, this isn't the right thing to do. So after this opportunity, there came his refusal. And this is what he did. It says, David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now, we don't know if Saul had his robe still on, which would have required a lot of stealth, or if he had actually laid it aside. But either way, David was able to sneak up there without being heard and take his sword and cut off a corner of Saul's robe and go back into the cave. And then he said to his men in verse 6, his refusal, he said, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed." Notice what David calls Saul. He says, my Lord, my master. And he says, the Lord, that's God's formal name, Yahweh, Yahweh's anointed. Saul was anointed by God to be the king. And David recognized that. And in fact, in these 2 chapters that we're looking at, there are 7 times when David called Saul the Lord's anointed. 7 times in these 2 chapters. He recognizes that God had anointed Saul to be the king of Israel. And David's thinking is, and you'll see this particularly in the next story, well, God put him here. It's up to God to take him away. It's not my job to do that. God placed him as king. God will remove him when the time is right. And so David had a piece of Saul's robe. It was probably Saul's royal robe. We talked about this a few weeks ago, that the king and his son had special robes to indicate who they were. And more than likely, that's the robe that we're talking about. And so it was clearly a piece of Saul's robe that he had, and this is what he did with it. Saul leaves the cave, and there's a confrontation. There's a confrontation between David and Saul. In verse 8, it says, afterward, David arose and went out of the cave, and he called after Saul, my lord the king. Notice what he calls him again. He says, you are my king. And Saul looked back, and David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. Isn't that amazing? This is the guy that's trying to kill him. And when he sees him and says, you're my king, he bows before him. And then David said, why do you listen to the words of men who say David seeks your harm? It's interesting. It's kind of tactful because he knew it wasn't men telling Saul to go kill David. He knew it was Saul's jealousy that was out to kill him. And so he's kind of tactful. He's not pointing fingers immediately. He says, why are you listening to men? Why are you pursuing me? And then he says in verse 10, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you into my hand in this cave, and my men told me to kill you, but I spared you, and I will not raise my hand against you. He confronts Saul directly. He says, look, I had every opportunity in the world to kill you, and I did not do that. And then he presents the evidence for his case. Verse 11, see, my father, notice the respect he uses again, the corner of your robe is in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and I did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have no reason to kill you. I think you're God's king, and here's the proof that I had every opportunity and I didn't do it. And he ends that confrontation with a plea, not to Saul, but a plea to God, because he is the real king. He is the real judge. He's the one who has all power and authority. And David's plea is not to Saul. David's plea is to the Lord in verse 14. And he starts out by saying, whom has the king of Israel come out to pursue? Who are you chasing? A dead dog after a flea? He says, look, I'm nobody. So why are you trying to pursue me? And then he says, may the Lord therefore be the judge and give sentence between you and me. May he deliver me from your hand. So there's this direct confrontation, and then David makes his plea to God that God would deliver him. And the story ends with a confession by Saul. And this is very surprising, because as we've seen Saul's story through this book of 1 Samuel, he started out so well, and then he just kept going downhill, and he didn't finish well at all. And we've seen in the last few stories how Saul was all about Saul. He was all about jealously guarding who he was. And so this confession is a huge surprise as we've seen Saul's character. And this is what he says, beginning in verse 16. This is what Saul said. He said, is that you, David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. In verse 17, you are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good where I have repaid you evil. Down in verse 19, may the Lord reward you with the good that you have done to me. And then in verse 20, the biggest surprise of all, I know that you shall surely be the king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Wow. Saul knew that Samuel had prophesied that he would not be the next king, that God would take the kingdom from him and give it to someone better. This is the first time we know of that he was willing to admit that that was true. He admits that. We know he knew that because Jonathan tells David at one point, I think in the last chapter, my father knows you're going to be the next king. My father knows that. So Jonathan had testified that Saul knew that, but this is the first time that he admits that, yes, the kingdom is being handed over to you. That's a pretty powerful admission considering who Saul was and who he'd become. And then they go their separate ways, which is kind of interesting because even with this confession, David seemed to understand that he couldn't go back to the king's court. He knew that Saul seemed to be mentally unstable, that Saul was having issues, and he's tried to kill him with his spear twice when David went in his court. He's been out pursuing him. Even with this admission, David knew that he couldn't return to Saul's court, and his suspicions proved true pretty quickly. And that's the story in chapter 26. A couple things happen in between time and 25. We'll come back to those next week, but flip the page over to 26 and we'll walk through. I'm going to put the outline up there again. You'll notice it's, other than the order switches in one place, it's the exact same outline we just saw of the other story. And so this is David sparing Saul's life, part 2. 26 begins, the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah and said, David is hiding in the hill country here. Now, this is the second time the Ziphites have tried to hand David over to Saul. One of the 11 stories we looked at last week, it was them who did that. And so the first part of this story, just like the last one, is Saul's pursuit. And it begins, it says, Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men to seek David in the wilderness. There again is his 3,000 men. Again, there's that desperation of I've got to overpower him. I've got to take his life. And it says that when he camped in a certain place, David sent out spies to learn if Saul had indeed come. It's interesting it says indeed come because David was further into the wilderness than he'd been before, a place that is probably not easy to sustain an army. And just to make sure the report he'd heard that Saul was coming is true, he sent out a couple spies to look. And sure enough, they saw Saul and his army encamped there, and that presents the next opportunity. And that opportunity comes when David said to a couple of his men, one of them is Abishai, who is David's nephew. Remember, David was the youngest of 8 brothers, and he had some sisters too. This is the son of one of his sisters, and from what we can tell, probably close to David's age, because David was the youngest of a huge family, and had some nephews close to his age. This guy had a couple brothers, Joab, who became the commander of David's army in later years, and Ashiel, who was one of the key soldiers in David's army, and Abishai. So this is one of those 3 men. And David asks, who's going to go down into the camp of Saul with me? We're going to go down there into their camp. And Abishai, his nephew, says, I'm going to go with you. And so they go down into the camp, and what they find is Saul is sleeping. He's in the very middle because all the soldiers camp around the king to protect him. But everyone else is asleep. Everyone is asleep. Even it says Abner, who was the leader of Saul's army and should have been his protector at that point in time, everyone was asleep. And Saul's spear was right there beside him, stuck in the ground. And Abishai has the great idea. He says, okay, here's the advice that comes again, just like last story. Hey, let me just take his spear and put it through him. Just one poke and we'll be done. We can be out of here and your problems will be done. But once again, David says no to that advice. And this is what he says. I want to read you these verses, chapter 26, verses 9 through 11. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he'll go out into battle and he'll perish. The Lord forbid that I should put my hand against the Lord's anointed. But now take the spear that is at his head and the jar of water and let's go. So they take Saul's water jug and they take his spear and they leave. And it's interesting that it says that nobody woke up, nobody knew what happened because they slept a deep sleep. And that word deep sleep is kind of interesting because it's a rare word for sleep in the Old Testament. It's used of Jonah when he was in the bottom of the boat and the storm came and he was totally asleep in this crazy storm. It's used of him in that way. It's also used, interestingly, of Adam when God put Adam into a deep sleep and took a rib out of Adam to form Eve. And so this is the kind of sleep we're talking about. I mean, if you go for an operation, you get knocked out and you know nothing that's going on. And that's the kind of sleep that God had put on the entire army of Saul so that this event could take place. The spear, if you remember, that Saul had, remember at one point there were 2 spears and 2 swords in all of Israel because they didn't have iron yet. The Philistines did. And we've talked about how that plays into these stories so often. And since that time, Israel's defeated the Philistines in a few battles, so they may have picked up a few weapons. But at one point, there were 2 spears and 2 swords in all of Israel that were made of iron. And Saul used that spear as a scepter. He kind of carried it around as representative of he was the king because he had one of the only spears there were. And you remember that Jonathan gave his sword to David, and we made a big deal about that because there wasn't very many swords. That was a huge gift. And so Saul has his spear right there. It kind of serves as his scepter. And some people think that David was making a statement. I think he took the easiest things that were available to prove that he had been there. But some people try to say David was making a statement because he took his scepter that shows who he was, and he took his royal robe who showed who he was. It may be that God allowed those things to be taken because it was to tell Saul something. You know, look, he's got your royal spear. Look, he's got your royal robe. I don't think he took them to make a statement. I think he took the easiest thing that he could just to do that proof. But that's kind of an interesting thought that's in that story. But anyway, he takes the spear, and he and Abishai leave. And then there's a confrontation just like the last story. David went, in verse 13, David went to the other side and stood far off on a top hill with a great distance between them. He had to get far enough away that nobody could chase him down. And he called to the army to Abner, the son of Ner, saying, "Are you going to answer me?" Now, Abner was the commander of the army who was sleeping right next to Saul. And David kind of taunts him, "Hey, you didn't protect your Lord. You didn't do your job." And he presents the evidence. He says, "Where is the king's spear and the water jug that was at his head?" In this conversation, Saul wakes up. He recognizes again David's voice. And David said to Saul, "Why does my Lord pursue after his servant? What have I done?" There's again that direct confrontation. Saul, what are you doing? Why are you pursuing me? Down in verse 20, near the end of that verse, once again, he calls himself a flea. Second time he does that. You're pursuing a flea. It's like hunting a partridge in the mountains with your whole army. I'm a nobody. Why are you pursuing me? And he proves with the evidence that he had every opportunity again to kill Saul, and he didn't do it. And Saul again makes a confession. And what's interesting about this one is the first confession, Saul was probably alone with David when he said, "I know you're going to be the next king. I've sinned against you." This time, he is shouting to David on a distant hill, and his whole army is around him. In other words, Saul's entire army heard what he said here. And this is what he says. He says, "I have sinned. I have acted foolishly. I have made a great mistake." Right in front of his whole army, Saul says, "I'm a fool." And so they all heard him say that. And then David said, "Okay, you can come and get your spear. Send one of the young men. Don't send one of your soldiers. Send one of your young armor bearers. He'll come up and get your sword." And then David made a plea. And again, the plea wasn't to Saul. The plea was to the real king, to God. He said in verse 24, "Behold, as your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord," that is of God. "May he deliver me out of my tribulation." So once again, David confronts Saul, but his plea isn't to Saul. His plea is to the King of the universe, that he would plead my case. And so once again, the two go their separate ways, and that's where chapter 26 ends. So what do you do when life doesn't go your way? What do you do? I was going to spend more time on the next point, but after the last few days, I thought I just want to talk about this a little bit. it seemed to me this past week that I had a dream, and I don't mean a literal dream. I mean, I could just begin to see what God was doing, and it was all coming together, and it seemed to die. It seemed that it just kind of crumbled. But when I think about it, so many people that God spoke to, that this is where you're going, this is what you're going to accomplish, this is what I want you to do, that dream died. And oftentimes it died for a very long time. Think about Moses. God said, you're going to lead the people out of Israel, or out of Egypt. And it was months before he could do that. It was setback after setback after setback. Think about Nehemiah. God gave him a vision to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. It was months before he had the opportunity to ask the king to send him to do that. Think about Joseph. He had a dream that his brothers would, literal dream this time, that his brothers would bow down to him as royalty. It took years of very hard things before that came to reality. Think about Paul. God said to Paul, you will be my witness to the Gentiles. It was years before that came to fruition. When you read through the New Testament, you don't realize there was a 14 to 20 year gap from the time God called Saul of Tarsus before he went out on his first missionary trip. Years in between there. Think about Abraham. You're going to be the father of a great nation. And it was years before he even had a child. It may have been decades. We don't know exactly the timing of that. It was certainly years. It may have been decades of heartache because they couldn't have a child. And think about Noah. Build a boat because you're going to save the world. It wasn't just decades. It was possibly a century before that came to fruition. And as I thought about that, I thought, I guess I shouldn't be too concerned if things are delayed a week. And so that kind of woke me up to the situation. What do you do when things don't go your way? So many of you shared already some things that happened this week. There are some rough things going on with our congregation all of this last week. And what do you do with that? Do you trust God, or do you take matters into your own hands? What do you do? It is so hard to know the balance between those two things, isn't it? Is God asking me to do something, or is God asking me just to sit back and do nothing? It is so hard to determine, when am I taking things in my own hands and when am I not? It's almost comical, but it's convicting to me that it was this very week, earlier in the week, when Kathy and I prayed through Psalm 127 together. And it begins with these words, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman keeps awake in vain. And I just had to pray, Lord, we want to make sure you're doing your work here and it's not us jumping in. That was Monday or Tuesday morning. That very day, as I was reading my own Bible reading a little bit later, I read Isaiah chapter 30. Guess how Isaiah chapter 30 begins? Woe to you who make plans that are not mine. And I'd stop again and say, God, what are you telling me here? We want to make sure we're on board with you. And it's later in that Isaiah chapter 30 where it says, in repentance and rest is your salvation. In quietness and trust is your strength. Sometimes we want to jump in and act, and God just says, listen and wait. That's a hard balance. It's one I'm not sure I did very well this week. Waiting is hard. Waiting is always hard. Waiting on God is probably even harder. Americans detest waiting. Surveys that say Americans detest waiting about as much as anything, and probably more than any other people in the world, because we're so used to instant everything. Waiting implies that we're helpless. It implies that we're insignificant. It implies that we're letting go and not taking control of things, doesn't it? We don't like that. We don't like that. And yet God says, wait. God often says, wait for me. One symptom that you're taking things into your own hands, or one thing that can happen, is that taking things in your own hands can take the form of what one commentator called stolen pleasures. Sometimes when things aren't going our way, we need to do something for ourselves. And in general, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, Thursday was when everything came crashing down on me, and I didn't get a chance to ask Amber, but that was a bad day for her. She was trying to get her summer pool opened, and nothing was working. And pumps weren't working, heaters weren't working, and all of this was going on. And we came home, we all cried on each other's shoulders on Thursday, and then we said, let's go get ice cream. There's nothing wrong with that. But so often, those hidden pleasures or those stolen pleasures are things that God says no. How often do people use the rough days they've had to do something they know they shouldn't do? I've had a rough day with my wife, so I'm going to go look at pornography. I've heard that before. It was a rough day at work, so I'm going to do this, which is something God strictly forbids. All manner of sin we excuse because we had a bad day and we need to do something for us. We know we're not waiting on God when that happens, and we have to be very leery of those kind of things. Go get ice cream instead, okay? It's a hard balance to know when you're waiting on God or when you're taking things in your own hand. I wish I could tell you more to help. I don't. I didn't do a very good job of that this week. But there's one particular area that David specifically addresses here. And I was going to spend more time on this, but I want to go through it quickly because there's something else we want to do today. And that is, what do you do when the boss hates you? You have a bad day because the boss hates you. Or some other authority over you hates you, doesn't care for you. Or what happens when the authorities over you persecute you because you want to do what's right? How often does that happen? In our society, we're becoming more and more of a culture that's all about how I feel. It's all about how I feel. It's not about what's truly right or wrong. And the more our society goes that way, the more Christian morality gets booted out the window. June is Pride Month. Anything we celebrate that we're proud of, we better be cautious about. It's not just sexual orientation and all those other things. It's usually, hey, I'm feeling pretty good about this because this is my feelings. And that's what we end up celebrating. A couple Christian organizations have started saying, let's make June Fidelity Month. Let's celebrate goodness instead of other things. I don't know if that'll catch on or not, but when you think about it, Pride Month means celebrating my feelings, what I think is right, what I want to do. That's what it's all about. Twice in the last 3 weeks, I've seen stories on the news where employees of a business got fired because someone was robbing that business and they protected the employees, they protected the customers, and they got fired. And they got fired because the source says our policy is you don't interrupt criminals who are robbing our store. They possibly saved some lives. They definitely saved that company some money, and the company said, no, you're gone. Isn't that sad? They stood up for what was right and got fired. You know what that tells the criminals? There's the store to go rob. Nobody's going to stop you. Might as well go rob it. I'd probably be a terrible criminal. I could probably rob that store. Nobody's going to stop you. It's sad when morality is set aside for so many other things. And so there's going to be more and more times when we're going to be persecuted by the authorities over us because we want to do what's right. How do we handle that? Let me just quickly run through the list, and the worship team will be coming up while I do this. Number one, don't raise a hand against that authority. Even when opportunities come to do so. That's what David did. He had 2 great opportunities. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. The more general principle there is just do what's right anyway. Do what's right anyway. Number 2, let them know, whoever those authorities are, that you want to be faithful. You want to be faithful. David said, my hand will not be against you. He said it in both of these stories. Saul, I'm not going to raise a hand against you. In the midst of it all, confess your trust in God. Confess your trust in God. That's what David did in Psalm 54, in Psalm 57, in Psalm 59, and in Psalm 52. All four of those psalms were written during this time when Saul was chasing his life. Let him be the judge instead. David said, may the Lord be judge between us. He is the one with ultimate authority. It's not the boss that's over you. And then ask God to deliver. Ask God to deliver. That's what David did in Psalm 59. It says it was written when Saul was sending men to watch his life to kill him. It says, deliver me from my enemies, O God. Protect me from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from those who work evil and save me from bloodthirsty men. Simply cry out to God to be your deliverer. And because we live in a different world than David was in, there's one other thing you can do. We can sometimes in this world remove ourselves from that authority if nothing else fails, particularly if it's a boss or something like that. Obviously, if it's a government authority, you can't do that. But if you have an opportunity and all else fails, you can remove yourself from that situation. You know, it's been a bad week for some of us, but maybe that will encourage you.